Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're embarking on a genuinely fascinating journey. We are going to trace the exact path of how our fundamental human values are built, literally piece by piece, starting from the moment we're in our infancy all the way through our school years. It's like a giant puzzle, and we're going to decode the very architecture of our beliefs. But before we start mapping all this out, let's do a quick mental mirror technique. I want you to think about your absolute core beliefs. You know, your views on honesty, democracy, or just how you treat other people. Where do those actually come from? Are they inherently yours, carefully chosen by you over time? Or were they inherited? Were they passed down, maybe completely invisibly, by the people and systems that raised you? Just keep that thought in the back of your mind as we go through this. So the journey obviously begins with the family. This acts as our absolute first informal agency of socialization. It's essentially our very first school, with our parents acting as our first teachers. And what makes this incubator so incredibly powerful is the intense emotional attachment. You might remember those famous contact comfort studies with baby monkeys, the ones who physically clung to their mothers, grew up emotionally secure and confident. Well, that basic, high-emotion bonding forms the absolute bedrock of a child's worldview. Okay, let's dive into this a bit more. The family environment has some extreme strengths when it comes to hardwiring our values. First and foremost, a child enters the family as a completely blank slate. Because they spend the vast majority of their early time with family, and because there's this incredibly high level of emotional trust, a family can teach a child virtually anything. They use both hard and soft tools to shape attitudes that will for sure last a lifetime. But how those values are shaped depends heavily on the methods used. The specific child-rearing practices parents adopt actually directly dictate a child's future societal values. It's pretty wild. For instance, if parents use a democratic approach at home, kids naturally grow up prioritizing democratic values in society. On the flip side, if a child is raised in a strictly authoritative family, the data shows they'll grow up with significantly less concern for democratic values, prioritizing strict obedience instead. And this brilliantly illustrates the power of role modeling. Kids are just constant sponges, right? They learn continuously, both consciously and subconsciously, simply by observing their family members. Take this quote from Mahatma Gandhi. It's a really powerful historical example. He credited the core techniques of his peaceful resistance, satyagraha and fasting, directly to observing his mother and his wife. Our parents' actions speak way, way louder to our developing brains than any lecture ever could. However, this foundation isn't always perfect. There are often cracks. Objectively speaking, families can impart some deeply problematic values. Sometimes a child gets totally conflicting messages. Maybe one parent teaches aggressive, win-at-all-costs values, while the other models unassertive ones. Or worse, the family might impose deeply unjust historical norms, things like casteism, patriarchal beliefs, or highly materialistic values that prioritize ruthless competition over care and compassion. Actually, the most common crack in the foundation is simple hypocrisy. You know, the classic, do as I say, not as I do. A perfect everyday example is a parent who constantly preaches the virtue of absolute honesty to their kid, but then the phone rings and they hand it to the child saying, hey, tell them Papa isn't home. Just like that, in an instant, that child's early understanding of truth is fractured. They quickly learn that rules are, well, situational. Let's move on and see how this builds as we leave the family unit and enter the next major phase. Education isn't just about memorizing facts. It's a profound transition from simply absorbing raw data, organizing it into information, understanding it as knowledge, and ultimately synthesizing all of that into wisdom. Which brings us to the school, our very first formal agency of socialization. This is an absolutely crucial stepping stone. It's where systematic learning takes over. For the first time, a child steps completely outside that private, cozy bubble of their family and engages with the broader community. Peer students, teachers, school staff. It's where they literally have to learn how to regulate their behavior in a larger society. To instill values, schools use a highly potent, heavily systematic toolkit. Formal education is actually often more effective than the family at certain types of socialization because it operates on authority and control. Schools use carefully designed pedagogic methods, they leverage the completely natural but incredibly powerful force of peer pressure, and they provide entirely new role models in the form of teachers and senior students. But you know, this systematic environment can also harden negative behaviors into lifelong attitudes. Consider the really chilling timeline of corporal punishment in schools. When a child suffers physical punishment as a student, they learn a very specific, very dangerous lesson about power. When they go to college, they might think it's perfectly fine to bully or rag their juniors. Later, as a parent, they'll believe physical punishment is the only way to discipline their own kids. And if they become a police officer, they might view custodial torture as a completely justifiable tool. A learned behavior in the classroom echoes through an entire lifetime. On the flip side, though, formal education can powerfully challenge the status quo. Textbooks and curriculums are critical here. Let me share a really fascinating anecdote from a Class 7 social science textbook in Kerala. The book presents this imaginative interview. A headmaster is speaking with a father, named Anwar Rashid, and a mother, Lakshmi Devi. The headmaster asks the father what religion he should list for their son on the school admission form. And the father's reply in the textbook is simply, "Let him choose his religion when he grows up." This is just a brilliant example of how a curriculum can be specifically designed to actively encourage curiosity, challenge orthodoxy, and promote progressive values like secularism and individual autonomy, right there in black and white on the page. And if we look around the world, we see that curriculums intentionally shape specific cultural values everywhere. In the Netherlands, plastic isn't used in early classes to naturally foster environmental sensitivity. It's much like in Bhutan, where students are explicitly taught to live in harmony with nature. When students study the French Revolution and world history, they aren't just learning dates. They're actively absorbing the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. When they study modern history, like Gandhi's train ride to Pretoria, they are being taught the fundamental value of standing up against injustice. Textbooks hold immense power, but we have to neutrally recognize how they can be manipulated too. Sometimes this happens via implicit bias, like a simple passage that reads, "Papa is coming from the office while mommy is cooking food," that inadvertently reinforces strict gender stereotypes without even trying. On the extreme end, it can be explicit brainwashing. For instance, the North Korean government actively uses school textbooks to aggressively condition children's brains against South Korea and Western liberal values. The tool itself is neutral. The application can be deeply political. Now, what's really interesting here is how schools operate outside the classroom. Experiential learning actively forges specific moral values. By simply taking students to visit nursing homes, schools actively inculcate compassion and altruism. Taking them to cultural centers and museums builds tolerance and a secular worldview. Organizing a simple tree plantation or street cleaning drive, that successfully ingrains the value of environmental protection far, far better than a textbook lecture ever could. Of course, the education pillar has its own deep flaws. If an educational system falls victim to the politicization of its curriculum, the moral development of its students gets totally derailed. Furthermore, if a school prioritizes rote learning, just memorizing facts to pass a test, over dialectics and critical thinking, it utterly fails to develop that ultimate goal of wisdom we saw earlier. And naturally, unequal access to quality education means these values just aren't imparted evenly across society. So when we bring the family and the school together, what is the ultimate goal of all this socialization, the whole shebang? It's the creation of an ideal society. A society that uses these two massive pillars to actively reject prejudices like casteism, communalism, and the dowry system. A society that ensures justice and equality for the nameless, faceless, and voiceless. Ultimately, the entire goal of instilling these human values is to nurture the physical, intellectual, and moral potential of every single individual. Which means we are all essentially the product of the emotional trust of our families and the systematic structures of our schools. And that brings us right back to where we started. After tracing this incredible journey from the cradle to the classroom, I'm going to ask you again, are your values truly your own? Or are they just the echo of your family and your teachers? It's something to think deeply about, isn't it? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.